I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
I'm joined by my Hudson Institute colleague, Arthur Herman, author of Freedom's Forge, the book on how the United States was able to forge an arsenal of democracy during World War II and, of course, lead the Allies to victory. Today, our conversation focuses on updating the concept of the arsenal of democracy to the arsenals of democracy.
You told us the story of how by 1944, our shipyards were producing 8 aircraft carriers a month. We're producing a warplane every 5 minutes. We're producing a merchant ship every 3 days. It's an incredible story, but could we do something like that again? And a lot of the questions arise from, what's required in order to do that? And what I say in my reply to that question, whether it was asked in 2012 when the book came out, or whether it's asked today, right, 10 years later, is yes, we can. But we can't do it alone.
Arthur is focused on bringing U.S. allies into the picture to really handle the fact that the world of the 2020s is deeply different to the world of the 1940s. We also discuss how the U.S. industrial base works and its current status in comparison to great power rivals like China. Hope you all enjoy this conversation. Arthur Herman, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. You literally wrote the book on the topic, Freedom's Forge. So let's have you introduce the concept of Arsenal of Democracy and why it matters.
Sure. And I'm delighted to be able to speak on a podcast that's named Arsenal of Democracy after the title and the not the title of the book, but certainly the subject. And the phrase, which was coined, as I explain in the book Freedom's Forge, not by Franklin Roosevelt, although he was the one who made it famous when he used it in a fireside chat that he did in December of 1940, in the darkest days of World War II, when Great Britain was under constant attack by the Nazis. And the fate of the free world really seemed to hang in the balance with the United States still neutral, still staying out of the conflict. But the idea that Roosevelt unfurled in that fireside chat was that America's industrial might, which was the biggest and best in the world at that point, 1940, that industrial might could be used and could be mobilized in order to supply the free world with the tools and the weapons that it would need in order to resist the assault of Nazism and fascism. And he was thinking specifically of Great Britain, but he was also included China at that time, embarked in a war with Imperial Japan. And with all of the free nations who would be willing to stand up to and resist Nazi tyranny, but that may not have had the kind of weaponry, the kind of tanks and planes and artillery that would enable them to fight a highly successful war machine like the ones that Hitler and his generals had created. And the idea, the arsenal of democracy, was that America's factories and shipyards and plants and facilities could become the means by which the free world would arm itself against tyranny, while also at the same time, remember this is December of 1940, while at the same time being able to keep America out of war by maintaining the fight against Nazism and against fascism over there, as opposed to having to confront it over here. Now, that notion of arsenal of democracy had 2 components then, right? One is obviously it's an arsenal, it's making weapons, modern weapons of war. But on the other hand, it's also an arsenal in the sense of it's a industrial enterprise producing those modern weapons of war. And how you do that and how you do that successfully was what Roosevelt was struggling with in December of 1940. And it's the subject of my book, Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. It's the subject of just how we were able to create that arsenal of a democracy in very short period of time that was able to not only arm the other democracies of the world, especially Britain, but then also other allies in the fight against Hitler, but also to arm ourselves. And that from December of 1940 to the midpoint in 1945, we went from a country which was still struggling with the issue of how to put modern planes in the air and tanks on the ground and warships at sea to becoming the greatest military force in the world. And that book is about how we did it.
And what really fascinates me is we're around the 10-year anniversary of the paperback edition of the book. As you've pointed out in previous discussions at Hudson, every single year you've gotten more and more engagement on the topic. It's really interesting that that could happen with a book. But what were you seeing 10, 12, 11 years ago that made you interested in this subject in the first place?
Well, that's a really good question. And part of it was historical. I felt that this was a story about World War II, the making of this incredibly productive military-industrial complex from turning America's peacetime economy into a wartime juggernaut. How did that happen? How was that done? Who was responsible really for it? That it was partly an historical problem. Here was a story about World War II which no one had really explored or had talked about in any kind of detail. But I also felt that it had in 2013, that it had a certain timeliness and a relevance, namely that there was a strong feeling in Washington, in industry, in the private as well as the public sector, whether it was at the Pentagon or in Congress, in the major defense companies, that somehow that secret had gotten away from us. That the process of building new defense systems, and at that time you had the F-35, for example, which was just coming into becoming operational. You had huge plans for launching the next generation naval warships like the Zumwalt destroyer and the Gerald Ford class carrier. You had this interest in other ways in which advanced technologies could be used and to build future weapon systems, defense systems. That somehow the secret of how we were able to do this efficiently, quickly, and to build in a decisive advantage against our military foes, which we did in World War II, that somehow that secret had slipped away. That through the process of growing bureaucracy, through the growing complexity of the defense industry itself, through the multiplicity of agencies and committees that insisted on overseeing how every dollar was spent and how every weapon system was being designed, and they all had to be as fault-free as possible, even before they took the field. All of these things had come, and were making it increasingly difficult for the United States to maintain that decisive edge. And I think one of the reasons why the book, and I'm very gratified as an author, always loves that when he feels like his book has a long shelf life, not just as an historical account, but also as a guide and a point of departure for talking about, well, where's our defense industrial base today, and what are the problems that we need to face today that maybe we can reach back to the past and find some solutions to those problems. That's very gratifying in some ways, but I think it's also a sign of the fact that what I felt was becoming a major problem already 2012 has now, I think, become a matter of urgency and of common knowledge that our defense industrial base, America's defense industrial base, which has its roots going back to World War II, back to the story I tell on Freedom's Forge, is in very serious trouble right now. The war in Ukraine has really demonstrated that. We can't seem to be able to produce the weapons, the systems, the technologies that we're really going to need if we get ourselves into a real shooting war or a kinetic conflict with a country like China or China and Russia together. That we have a crisis, and that maybe some of the answers lie in how we did it in the past that can show us how we can do it in the future.
And I think a lot of listeners to this podcast and viewers, of course, as well, too, are going to be aware of the defense industrial base challenges. I guess the other thing I'd ask you about in the year 2023 is, where does the civilian manufacturing side of things set? Because the key part of your story is conversion, taking folks from industries. So let's put the defense industrial base to the side. In 2023, how should we think about the civilian capacity aspect of this?
Well, let's think about it, first of all, in the context of 1940, because I think that'll help to sort of clear up where we are today in that relationship that you've just identified. Now, that phrase, arsenal of democracy, Roosevelt made it famous, but it was, in fact, a phrase coined by the man he brought in the summer of 1940 to help show him how the United States was going to be able to gear up to fight a modern mechanized war from what was basically a standing start. The 19th largest army in the world. That was the United States in 1939, 1940. How are we going to be able to fight a foe like Nazi Germany if war comes to our shores? The man he turned to, interestingly enough, was an industry executive, Bill Knudsen. Bill Knudsen, who was CEO of General Motors, a Danish immigrant who had come up and worked his way up, literally, from the assembly line to becoming a major force, first at Ford Motor Company, then CEO of Chevrolet, and then CEO of General Motors. And that phrase was coined by Knudsen because Knudsen understood that what was going to make it possible to build that modern military capacity the United States was going to need in the world that was coming apart in 1940 was really going to depend on how you could harness America's most important economic asset, its industrial economy, how you could harness that to produce those modern weapons of war efficiently, quickly, and at the same time use that industrial might and the companies that had created it to constantly improve and upgrade that military equipment that you were making. That, in other words, if you turn to the most productive companies, and in 1940, in Knudsen's mind, that included the automobile companies, which were the really driving engine of the American economy at that point, but also the electrical companies like General Electric and Westinghouse, the communications companies like AT&T, for example, that once you harnessed their know-how in how to produce commercial products that of the highest possible grade with the quickest possible speed and at the lowest possible cost. Once you harness that kind of power, that kind of economic muscle, and put it to work in something entirely different, namely to making airplanes and airplane engines and tanks and artillery pieces and machine guns, if you could do that, that you would have an insuperable advantage against opponents like Nazi Germany or like Imperial Japan, who had very advanced weapons systems, as we would call them today. They were on the cutting edge of American military technology in 1940. But you would have the ability to not only outproduce them in terms of the numbers, but you could also at the same time constantly upgrade and change and develop the quality at the same time. And it really happened. The very first weapons, planes, and tanks that we started producing using Knudsen's approach of harnessing commercial companies and turning them loose on these problems. How am I going to make a tank? How am I going to make a machine gun in sufficient numbers to arm the United States to fight a war like this? Making warplanes, making airplane parts and engines. That once you got that, the very first iterations of that kind of military systems were pretty pretty crude stuff, like the P-40 fighter, for example, totally outclassed by the Japanese Zero or the Me-109. The earliest tanks that came out of the arsenal of democracy, like the Grant tank, really not up to fighting against German panzers as they were by 1941 and 1942. But then with the next round of production, the next iteration, improvements came in, armament got more powerful, defensive armor was built in ways that, and engines that were able to move faster and quicker. And so what you ended up with from the P-40, you ended up with the P-51 Mustang. Instead of the Lee tank, you end up with a Pershing tank. And you end up with an ability then to incorporate innovation with productivity. And that's, I think, one of the key breakthroughs here, Marshall, to bear in mind is that in today's world, including our defense industrial base, we have a lot of worry and concern about the need for innovation, of how do we develop a acquisition and a planning and programming system at DoD that can move at the speed of innovation. And productivity and production tends to be put into a separate compartment, separate category. But in fact, if you switch it around and you focus on productivity and focus on production, what will happen is that the innovation will come in alongside of it. And people will always be thinking of new ways to make it better, to make it faster, to make it cheaper, and to incorporate new elements, new components, new parts that no one had thought of when they originally launched a prototype or moving in a proof of concept, but which suddenly transforms something which was an okay product into something that really dominates the field. And that was the production, the secret of mass production that Bill Knudsen and his colleagues, as I described them in the book, what they really unleashed was one that was not only going to be able to outproduce the Axis in quantity, but would outclass them in terms of quality.
And the other figure you profile is Henry Kaiser, so it'd be great for you to introduce him as well.
Henry Kaiser he became an iconic figure for the story of the arsenal of democracy at the time. Not that many people knew very much about Bill Knudsen. He tended to work behind the scenes, sealing the deals, bringing on his fellow automobile manufacturers and others into the arsenal of democracy production, even before war came. Kaiser was there also before war came, making the Liberty ships freighters. But when war came, Kaiser's public image grew and grew, and he really became seen as the wonder man who was able to turn any kind of war material that was needed into a sort of magic mushroom of profuse quantities and also of superior quality. But his real story, and the story that I link him up with, particularly with the Freedom's Forge, is the story of the Liberty ships, the freighters, which the U.S. government worked to contract with Great Britain to carry the needed vital supplies from the United States to Britain at a time when America was still neutral in the conflict, had not yet been involved with it. The Liberty ship design was a design that was, should we say, made for a one-way trip. The original Liberty ships were all seen as ships that would be able to carry foodstuffs, war material across the Atlantic and disembark and unload in England, but might not make it back on the trip back because of the U-boat warfare. Mm-hmm. So it was basically a throwaway ship design from the beginning. Very, very simple. Not a lot of comfort, creature comforts built into it, and one which, as I say, was not expected to stay afloat more than a couple of years with this. Well, what happened was, and I explain in the book, is that when Kaiser and his engineers got hold of the Liberty ship designs, they found ways in which to make these ships in terms of the materials, in terms of the production side, even though they had never made ships before. even though they had never built a ship in their lives, they saw the possibilities for mass producing these things in ways that not only, again, would produce them in quantity, but also give them a particular quality that would make them incredibly seaworthy. And in fact, they were. In fact, it's amazing to think that the original Liberty ships of World War II, which was basically a throwaway design for a ship on a one-way trip, that those Liberty ships that came out of those shipyards were still afloat in the 1990s and still in use in the 1990s. That the James River Ghost Fleet, Reserve Fleet, in the 1990s still had a row of Liberty ships who were part of it. And the very last of those Reserve Fleet Liberty ships was taken away to be broken up in 2008. That's how long this throwaway design was. And it was all because of the way in which Kaiser and his team were able to build and construct these things. And they changed shipbuilding as an industry for good.
Something I'm curious about, and I think this is a good way of kind of explaining how the American system of defense industrial production works, is think of kind of like what we could call one of the ultimate examples of technological innovation, like the Me-262, the first jet fighter. The Germans deploy it, but critically, could have really made a difference in the air war. But critically, Adolf Hitler, upper levels of the Nazi high command, mandate that instead of using this as a jet fighter to go against B-17s, once again, the actual problem, it has to serve as a fighter bomber, which delays it. You then have the problems you articulated of the inability to produce them at sufficient numbers. I struggle to imagine a world where FDR is like, you know what, the P-51, it really needs X, or the P-47 needs this, or that. So how does the American system during this process, how does it work?
You know your story of the Me-262 very well. And that was a major problem that they had is that there was a conflict between, should we say, the CONOPS, right? Concept of operations. Should this be an interceptor fighter to stop the endless stream of Allied bombers devastating German cities and industrial plant? Or should it be used in an offensive capacity, which is what Hitler's idea was? Yeah, I think that was definitely a problem that was posed with the Me-262s that they did produce, that they did make. But the real problem, I think the real challenge was, and where the U.S. system, the American system as you call it, had a built-in superiority to both the German and the Japanese, was just simply they couldn't make enough of them. They just didn't have the kind of assembly line, mass production techniques that American industry was able to bring to bear to aircraft manufacturing, machine gun manufacturing, airplane manufacturing, that the Germans were able to achieve that. And one of the things that you come to realize when you look closely at the German defense industrial base in World War II versus the American industrial base is the degree to which, almost from the beginning, the German industrial base, which was very impressive in 1939 and 1940, is just playing in the junior league by comparison to what the Americans are able to do and able to achieve. So you have, on the one hand, you've got ambiguity about what the role of that could have been decisive weapon, the 262 jet fighter. You have ambiguity about what role should it really play. You've got the fact that industries just can't produce them in the numbers that would be decisive in order to really change the balance of forces in the course of the war. Then you've got a third problem, and that's fuel. And that is one of the other parts of the Freedom's Forge and the arsenal of democracy is the energy side of it, and the way in which the United States was able to gear up its ability, its oil production, to serve not only for its own needs in the course of the war, but also for the needs of its allies, both in Britain and then, of course, on the other side of the Pacific in the war against Japan. And from that point of view, that is a really essential part and component of what that defense industrial base was the ability to supply all of the petroleum, all of the oil that was really necessary to sustain that big industrial plant, and the ships and the planes and and tanks that were coming out of American factories. Wouldn't have done much good if you've got more Sherman tanks coming out, by the tens of thousands, but not enough fuel to run on. And that's exactly the problem that the German industrial base ran into. They could produce record numbers of fighters. They did in 1944, for example, but there was no fuel in which to run on them. They couldn't gear up an industrial plant to produce enough synthetic aviation fuel or fuel for any of the other, for ground forces, to really be able to compete even on an uneven playing field with what the Allies and the Americans could bring to bear.
That example you just gave just brings to mind something I learned recently. I was reading James Holland's second volume of his War in the West series, and he pointed out that, if you're thinking of the Eastern Front, you have the different German army groups, and one of the key objectives of one of the army groups was actually securing the southern oil fields near the Caucasus, but the Germans didn't actually have the ability. Let's say they hadn't gotten the oil. They didn't actually have the ability to actually transport and utilize that oil back in the first place, which you're like, oh my, wow, that goes to the structural problems you're discussing there. But I guess to kind of take this to today for a second, we have a lot of discourse about, well, how strong is U.S. military today? What's our industrial base like? What does the energy side of this picture look like today? Is this something which has degraded? Does it face challenges? How do you think about it?
Well, I think it's an important part, and I'm glad you put your finger on that one, because it's kind of an overlooked part of our defense industrial base today. How are we going to be able to supply and sustain military forces in the air and on the ground? And how are we able to sustain an industrial plant here unless we have sufficient energy in order to maintain it and keep it going? To my mind, Marshall, therefore, an important part of a future arsenal of democracy has to be energy independence. We have to be able to keep our resources, our hydrocarbon resources, available to give us that kind of flexibility and agility to deal with the whole range of logistical problems, supply chain problems we'll be facing, again, in the case of a protracted conflict here. But this touches on another issue, I think, which I know you're thinking about by raising the question. And it's the question I often get when I lecture about Freedom's Forge. In various venues, sometimes with private corporations, sometimes at universities. And that is the question, could we do it again? They say, you've told this magnificent story about how America was able to produce in 5 short years 2/3 of all the war material used by all of the Allies in World War II. It's a staggering number. You told us the story of how by 1944, our shipyards were producing 8 aircraft carriers a month. We're producing a warplane every 5 minutes. We're producing a merchant ship every 3 days. It's an incredible story, but could we do something like that again? And a lot of the questions arise from, what's required in order to do that? And what I say in my reply to that question, whether it was asked in 2012 when the book came out or whether it's asked today, right, 10 years later, is yes, we can, but we can't do it alone. That our industrial base is at a point now where the issue of supply chains has now become a global one. In 1940, 1941, World War II, almost all of the material that we needed in order to build an arsenal of democracy was right here in the 48 states, with some exceptions, some rare earths and so on from Latin America. But by and large,
within our
everything
hemisphere.
Everything was within our hemisphere and really all within the continental United States. That's no longer the case. Likewise, that most of the advanced technologies that today that we depend upon and that we are still leaders in, artificial intelligence, in quantum technology, which I work a lot on here at Hudson, with regard to what we call unmanned systems, drones, for example, for robotics, 3D printing, all these advanced technologies. This is all a knowledge base and a technology base that's spread around the world. We're no longer the sole proprietors of the knowledge that's required in order to carry forward these kinds of technologies in areas like AI or hypersonics, directed energy for weaponry, and so on. But a lot of that technology, a lot of that know-how is spread out among our democratic allies, including the productive aspect. And I come back to my point. You think about it in terms of productivity, innovation can find its place within that and slip into that, especially in the high tech sphere. So what I've been talking about and what I've been working on here at Hudson over the last year or two has been to translate the notion of the arsenal of democracy in World War II into an arsenal of democracies that includes the United States and its closest, most trusted allies to produce and develop those advanced weapon systems that will be able to guard us and protect the free world now, but also in the foreseeable future. A 21st century arsenal of democracies, and of thinking about what is it, how do we build that kind of strong global network of productive companies and countries that can be able to maintain and build that decisive edge that we had and were able to provide to the Allies in World War II, but which we now can share as a knowledge and technology and production base with those same allies in today's security environment.
What's the timeline on the arsenals of democracy? The reason why I ask is we did a great episode of our Hudson colleague, Nadia Shadlow, and her central point was we need timelines attached to these big projects. So
always. That's one of the key aspects of the original arsenal of democracy was three advantages that they had. Number one is they knew who the target was, right? And it was primarily Nazi Germany, also Imperial Japan, but not the Germans were the main ones. That's who you have to fight against if you're going to be fighting a war. So you better prepare as a way in which to outclass or outdistance their advantages on the battlefield or in the air or at sea. Number two is the metrics. How many do you need? What's the requirement there? And then number three is the timeline. This is the number we need, and this is when we need it. And if you think about it in those terms, what you can do with an arsenal of democracies is you can stagger those kinds of weapon systems, those advanced technologies in ways that make it both achievable on the one hand, but also utilizable as we find ourselves drawing closer and closer to the possibility of a real kinetic conflict, whether it's over Taiwan with China or whether the war in Ukraine expands and becomes one that engages more NATO nations, and which the United States will have to step up in even more prominently than it has already. So the timelines, I think, depend upon a couple of things. Number one, the timelines are going to depend on how valuable are these technologies now and applicable to our situation today. And there I would say, for example, that your timeline for hypersonics development is going to be pretty tight. For quantum technology, probably a little bit further out, but maybe not out as far out as some people might imagine. A lot of those technologies, quantum technologies, can apply right now, can be very useful right now. Likewise with AI, a lot of applications that can take place now, but the further reaches of our artificial intelligence, where the really big revolutionary breakthroughs are coming, they're not here yet. But we can think about that and think about their applications in I'll call it a wartime setting or in national security direction here. But the other thing is, and I think this is the other ingredient that I would say the fourth one is, you have to think about this as being more than just a series of government and government agreements. That you have to engage the companies that are marshaling those technologies, pioneering the big breakthroughs, who are the productive ones in these areas, whether they're in Japan or in South Korea, or in Great Britain or Australia, to marshal those companies and bring them together with their American counterparts to really produce and really think about how do we what do we need? When do we need it? And how many can we deliver here? I think it's a mistake to turn to them to supply the answer of what is it that we need. That is a decision that has to be made by our military and by our civilian leadership in government. But the answer to the other questions, how many can you make and when you can deliver, that's one you can put to companies and sort of say, we really need you to step up here and to be involved in helping us to achieve that goal. And build your partnerships. Find ways in which to build the connections with your counterparts in Germany, with your counterparts in Japan, with hypersonics, for example, with your counterparts in India. And we'll find a way in which you can all work together and bring this arsenal of democracies into reality. What's required is a combination both of political will, but also a role of government that's seen, I think, in a slightly different way than we've become used to. And that is that we have to understand that the key to the arsenal of democracy in World War II was that Bill Knudsen and his colleagues understood that there was this tremendous, innovative, entrepreneurial energy in America's private sector. There was the same energy and drive and need to achieve in our military. Our military thinks about how to get things done. So does the private sector, right? Engineers, corporation executives, entrepreneurs of all kinds. What government's job is not to tell one or the other what to do, but to facilitate the link between the two so that the energies of the private sector can flow into and animate and expand the possibilities for our military, for the warfighter. That's what they did in World War II. Government found itself in a slightly humbler role, shall we say, of overseeing the flow, overseeing these kinds of developments, making sure that they were headed towards an overruns, not trying to control, not trying to dictate what took place here. The arsenal of democracies will need government to see it in pretty much the same way. And that is, how do we facilitate the links between the private sectors and industries in our respective allied countries, and how do we bring them together in partnerships in ways that our militaries, not just the U.S., but also of our allied militaries, can benefit from and utilize these to decisive advantage. That's going to be the flow, if I like what I call the energy flow of an arsenal of democracies for the 21st century.
Something you kind of just did there, but I want to make very explicit, is in an earlier talk you gave at Hudson, you really delineated that we have warfighters, we have civilian leadership, and then we have, of course, private industry. It's pretty clear how we get civilian leaders, elected office, appointments, et cetera. Same thing of warfighters. West Point exists to give us our next generations of Pattons and Eisenhowers. When it comes we hope, let's knock on wood there. But at least there's a process set up. We can articulate it. Right. Looking at the middle part, though, looking at the private industry bit, there have been a variety of books that have come out in the wake of your book, and something that tends to happen, I don't think this is the choice of the authors. This is more likely the publisher or the publicity folks who are working there. They basically say what the auto industry in the 1920s and 1930s were to America, Silicon Valley is today. So let's look at this arsenal of democracy issue and take lessons from that. So Bill Knudsen maybe isn't coming from forward in the same way today if there's a crisis. Where do you think the private sector pipeline, how does that look now today, given the changes in America's industrial base?
Well, that's a big and important question, isn't it? And I think that Silicon Valley is going to be part of the solution, but it may not be the only solution. I think a lot of what we've seen with regard to Silicon Valley and its interactions with the Defense Department and with questions about national security and national defense since the book came out, and certainly in the most recent few years, is that a lot of their perspective on things is a different one than that of executives in World War II, shall we say, or during the Cold War, who had a very clear sense of, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and what we really need to do is to make sure the good guys win by mobilizing all of our talents and abilities to achieve that. I think that what you have in the case of many Silicon Valley executives and their employees is an outlook which is more, shall we say, geared towards the larger global picture, more of a globalist approach to these things, in which the questions of national interest, of national security, are subordinated to a larger picture, whether it's about the idea of the global community, the global village, or whether it's about climate change. And so the imperatives that DoD, let's say, right, or the military, or even a White House would insist upon as this is what we need to defend our national interest, and this is what the technology that you do that could be really helpful to us, and really valuable to us. That the part of some Silicon Valley executives and employees may be that actually we're not really comfortable supplying you with those needs. You know where we saw this most recently was Google's reaction to Project Maven, the project that came out of the Pentagon to use AI facial recognition technology as a way to identify terrorists. And they turned to Google as a way in which to use Google's AI applications to accelerate this development, Project Maven. And Google employees revolted. They said, "We don't want to be part of that. We don't think it's a fair use of the technology that we've developed for peaceful means to use it to kill people, even terrorists, and therefore we don't want to be part of it." And Google had to walk away from Project Maven. Now, I'm not saying that that's a typical attitude on the part of many Silicon Valley companies, but it's definitely there. It's definitely baked into the corporate culture at a lot of these places. And that makes them, I think, on the one hand, uncomfortable to deal with the Pentagon from a point of view of, is this technology going to be used to kill people in ways that we have moral objections about? That's one thing. But even more important than that is the reluctance to work with the Pentagon, the federal government, because of regulations. It's an extremely expensive and time-consuming process going out and getting a government contract for anything, but particularly for sensitive technology relating to Defense Department needs or what our military requires. And so I think part of the aloofness that Silicon Valley has had up until now with regard to working on, we'll call them weapons systems, national security systems of all kinds, has sprung from those two hesitancies. Hesitate about what use will these technology be put that we may not agree with and have moral objections to, number one, but also the fact that it's just a lot easier to bring our technology to bear in the commercial marketplace. We see a much better return on our money. We can get our technology developed the way we want it, and we don't have all of the bureaucratic hoops we have to jump through in order to get a contract to work with Defense Department or DHS or any of the other government agencies that go with it. So part of what will make for a future arsenal of democracies is also finding ways to streamline the process so that those who you want to be part of an arsenal of democracies, those companies whose technology is going to be important, even essential, for building that 21st century arsenal, will feel like the welcome mat is down, the door is open, and we're ready to do business with you, rather than fill out these forms, go through the federal regulations that are required that you must comply with, and then get back to us when you think you're ready to take on this kind of work. That's the surest way to make sure that an arsenal of democracies doesn't happen.
And it seems to me that the good news on the Silicon Valley front is the difference between 2023, late stage 2023, and the mid 2010s with Project Maven is just that we've transitioned to an era where, let's assume you're just your average top tier school grad working at a tech company. If you're thinking of the military, your image is just going to be struck probably 2013. It involves a drone. You're talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan. There's something inherently offense based about that versus in 2023, there's a real question about great power competition, pure adversaries. There's a defensive nature to that I think it is important. So,
I mean, there's no doubt China has changed the equation tremendously. You're absolutely right. In 2012, 2013, there were only a few of us who were worried about the China threat. It was not a widespread perception that this was going to be an ongoing problem for us militarily as well as geopolitically. That's changed a lot. And therefore, a lot of what people think about in terms of the technologies that we need in order to both to defend ourselves and our allies on the one hand, but also to the need to overtake and to maintain our technological lead over China in all of these areas so we don't get some nasty surprise that we weren't anticipating in another 5 or 10 years. That's definitely changed the equation and has brought more urgency into the discussion, both about what's the state of our defense industrial base, which during the global war on terror could be pretty rudimentary. There wasn't a lot of call for really, conventional warfare types of systems in fighting the war on terror or even fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was a limited demand on our defense industrial base capabilities. So that's number one. And then the other is that the war in Ukraine has exposed that this is a problem not just for advanced technologies of the future, but for conventional arms of the present. And we've got to find a way in which to get our production numbers back in that area as well.
The key thing on China then, though, is that with China, you have an adversary that not only has the potential to, but in many ways, especially when it comes to shipbuilding, has exceeded our industrial capacity. This would be the first time we're actually competing in that sense. What are your thoughts on that topic?
You again put your finger on a key issue, and that is where we are with regard to sea power and maritime power. We're still the world's most dominant sea power, but we're no longer the world's dominant maritime power. And China's shipbuilding capacity, its ability to turn that shipbuilding capacity into its version of an arsenal of autocracy.
That's your sequel. That's the book.
That's the sequel next. For the Chinese defense industrial base is pretty scary, no doubt about it. But again, the answer is, what about our allies? We have shipbuilding capacities in Japan and South Korea, in Israel, in ways that could be hugely advantageous to the U.S. if we think about an arsenal of democracies that goes beyond simply our own naval power, our own naval power capacity and capabilities, but it expands into this larger range of countries and the technologies, including unmanned systems, that could be brought to bear to redress the balance here. So I think when thinking in those terms, when you look beyond simply where America's shipbuilding capacity is and look further out across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, into the Mediterranean in the case of Israel, then you see many more possibilities and opportunities for taking advantage and even overtaking what China's advantage is in terms of that mixture of maritime and naval power and what goes with it. There's been a recent survey of the world's most advanced tech economies. And it's a very interesting survey because of the top 20 advanced technology economies, all except 2 are democracies. Isn't that interesting?
What are the 2?
The other 2 are Hong Kong and United Arab Emirates, which is a kind of ally. I mean, we have good relations with them. Where does China score on the high-tech economies? It scores 32 on the list, way down the list. Russia and Iran are other threats, don't even register on the count here. And I think when you think about it in those terms, and when you think about it in GDP terms, is again where U.S. and its leading democracies combined have a GDP double that of China. When you think about it in those terms, when you think about it in terms of the decisive advantage that our high-tech leadership, our strong economies in the industrialized democracies, when you think about it in those terms, you begin to realize that China has, sure, it has certain advantages now, but so did Nazi Germany. Sure, it looks like a scary and really dangerous adversary, and it is. Make no mistake about that. But if you look further on down the timeline, look further out on the horizon, you begin to see where an arsenal of democracies could have a huge advantage versus China and its allies, and could bring us a new era, not just in terms of global peace and security, but also for global prosperity in ways that we haven't even explored yet, let alone tapped.
Final question. I was thinking back earlier to something you said where you remarked that we're, producing, 5 airplanes in some specific, 5 fighters in some specific time frame in one part, and we're like, well, that's exciting.
One every 5 minutes.
One every 5 minutes, right there.
That's pretty good.
One every 5 minutes. And on the one hand, that's exciting. That's what we want to work towards, especially listening to this podcast. On the other hand, that's also a disaster because that means World War III is broken out. And it seems to me, for good reason, you actually start Freedom's Forge off with a Hitler quote where Hitler basically accuses the United States of being decadent. We produce records, there's Hollywood, but he's really besmirching that industrial capacity. Therefore, the manufacturing potential we had in 39-40 was just not a sufficient. Now, it's a good thing that it didn't deter Hitler because that's a good thing, but we're kind of trying to work with the concept here. You would hope that a 21st century arsenal of democracies.
That's what they call the cunning of history.
Yes.
What looked like a disaster then actually turns out to be a blessing later on, right?
And now it feels as if when we're in an era of deterrence, how could an arsenal of democracies actually successfully deter? How do we guarantee that there isn't someone in an adversary country right now looking at a, TikTok or some fight on Twitter and saying, oh, look at the 21st century Americans. They're decadent. Yes, they've done this before. It's going to fall again. It seems like avoiding that scenario is the principal thing we're working towards here.
Well, you see, now that's interesting. And this is a great way to think about this. And come back to our question, could we do it again? Hitler never underestimated America's industrial capacity. He was actually quite scared about that. What he downplayed was America's ability to mobilize that for war. That America's warlike spirit just wasn't there. It was a decadent democracy that even if they've got this whole plant, property, and equipment that can outproduce and so on, they'll just never use it. They'll never be able to find a way to gear up. Boy, was he wrong. But the question of could we do it again without
doing it,
without doing it again, as we did with the war. This is why I think the book is so relevant, and why I think the lessons in it are constantly proving themselves to be correct year after year as we go forward. And that is, over half of the book, well, almost half of the book takes place before the outbreak of World War II. That what Knudsen had said to Roosevelt was, give me 18 months and I'll have a war production machine of a kind that you've never seen before here. And he got those 18 months. The arsenal of democracy was well underway before any bombs dropped at Pearl Harbor. The arsenal of democracy speech, remember, is December, where we started, December 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor here. And this is what Knudsen understood, is that you could take America's key economic advantage, which was its system of mass production, and turn that into a strategic asset that would be of value as a way to deter war as well as a value to fight one. And that's what we need to think about, where our advanced technologies and where our advantage in working with our democratic allies has that same kind of decisive advantage for deterring war with China. At the Pentagon, there's been a lot of talk in the recent years, shortly after my book came out, about what's called an offset strategy. of using technology as a way to offset your opponent's quantitative advantage, whether it was the Soviet Union's quantitative advantage in terms of land armies and tanks by using nuclear deterrence, or whether it was offsetting the Soviet Union's advantage in nuclear deterrence by using advanced technology like GPS and stealth technology and precision-guided munitions, the second offset, or using AI and unmanned systems, what the Obama Pentagon had dubbed as the third offset. Well, what I have said and said before is that the numbers that the count is misnumbered. That the first real offset was Bill Knudsen's, when he said that it's our system of mass production which will offset the quantitative advantage that the Germans or the Japanese or the fascists have in their arsenal and what they're able to do. So you don't have to rely on mobilization of a nation to fight a war in order to achieve that decisive advantage. That you use the offset when you're not at war, when you don't have a wartime emergency in which it's this or nothing, right? It's all out or nothing. And we were able to do that. If we had not had Bill Knudsen working on this since the summer of 1940, when bombs dropped at Pearl Harbor, I don't know when we would have been mobilized. It might have taken 1943 before we would have been able to strike back in any kind of capacity against the war, both in Europe and in the Pacific. We probably wouldn't have been able to fight two wars at the same time. We probably would have had to abandon Europe in order to recover and regain some kind of position vis-a-vis Japan and the Pacific. We wouldn't have been able to fight a two-front war if Knudsen hadn't offset the advantage using mass production, industrial mass production, as a way to gain decisive advantage against future Axis adversaries. So you're right. We don't want to face these choices when we're in it, but we can face it before we get there if we focus on the right kinds of advantages and on the right kinds of technologies, and I would say now, today, the right kinds of allies who can bring that offset into reality.
That is an excellent place to end. Arthur Herman, thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.